what we thought we'd do is we'd start with a small poll just to see where you're all coming from, and that'll feed into the talk later on. So we're going to set the poll going and ask you 3 questions. So the first question is about the size of your organization. And I put in the chat what we mean by this. So we've got micro, less than 10,000, small, 10 to 25,000 visitors. This is medium, 25 to 50,000, and large, more than 50,000, or if you're represents an organization with multiple sites. There's a second question there, which is about the type of organization: independent, locally authority run, or a trust, university-based, national organization, or something else. If it's an other and you want to put it in the chat, that'd be fab. And then final question, which is about whether you're paid staff with volunteers or fully volunteer run. And so far, everyone is paid staff with volunteers. And we've got quite a spread there, quite an even spread between independent, local authority, university, and national organization, and a couple of others, and then erring towards the larger organization, but some micro and small organizations as well. Right then, that's good. That will come back. We'll come back to think about that during the presentation. So thank you very much. Right then, let me share the screen and we'll start. Okay, can you see the presentation? I got a tiny nod there from Sam. Thank you very much. So we're looking at volunteering in the wake of the lockdown. When we first advertised it, we called it Volunteering in the Wake of the Pandemic, and then someone on Twitter pulled us up because the pandemic hasn't ever really gone away, which is a fair point, so we changed the title. Largely this has come about because I was chatting to volunteer managers and they were talking about how it was difficult, they were finding it more difficult to recruit people. So we started sort of thinking about that. And what I'm going to do in this presentation is I'm going to talk about sort of national trends in volunteering across all volunteer involving sectors that we know about, and then some more museum specific trends. And then we'll look a little bit about volunteer motivations and other changes that might be happening. And then we'll have a discussion. There's a tiny plea for help at the end. So national trends for England. This is from Grotz and Leonard's book, Involving Volunteers, which is a really nice book if you fancy a read. And they collated data from the Citizenship Survey and the Community Life Survey to give a 20-year sort of overview of volunteering trends. They argue with the distinction between formal and informal volunteering, and instead talk about volunteering as an individual or volunteering through groups. What you can see overall is a very sort of long-term drop in numbers of people doing either of those things. There's a peak-ish or a rise here around 2012, which they linked to the 2012 Olympics. And then obviously you've got around 2020, you've got COVID. So we see a drop in volunteering through groups, but you also see a peak volunteering as individuals, which drops off again afterwards. So that's what we know about long-term. And again, this is for England and it's across all volunteer involving sectors. I have data for Scotland, which is from the Scottish Household Survey reports, which there is decline, but also a lot of sort of long-term stability. The latest data is from 2021, and in the report, they said they'd changed their research methods, so that data is not comparable to everything else that's gone before, which is a little bit frustrating, but there you go. So I put it in as this little red circle so you know where it is. So the latest data sort of seems to suggest, again, this sort of stability. The Scottish Household Survey data only started asking a question about informal volunteering in 2018, so we don't have that long-term data for informal volunteering for Scotland. I don't have any data for Wales or Northern Ireland as yet. Because I just can't escape work when I go on holiday. I was in the Netherlands over Easter and bumped into some people who worked in the museum sector there and started asking them about whether they were finding it harder to recruit, and they said they were too. So I went and had a look at the Dutch data. This is from the Dutch Central Bureau of Statistics. and it looks at volunteering with an organization at least once in the last year. And again, there's a sort of gentle decline, maybe less than we saw in England, and certainly a higher baseline than we saw in England. But also, really interestingly, the data shows a small uptick in volunteering in the last year or so. And digging into it, the uptick is more noticeable for older people, so age 65 to 75, than other age groups, which is kind of interesting. And there are also reports coming out of America saying that the organizations there were finding it harder to recruit volunteers. So I went and dug out the AmeriCorps survey data. There's only 3 years here, 2017, 2019, 2021. They distinguish between informal helping and formal volunteering. And the informal helping is fairly stable across that period, but there's this noticeable drop in formal volunteering over the last couple of years. And that was what was getting lots of people quite worried. So overall, the data across all sectors is general decline. There's some variation in there, but that's the sort of the broad picture. We can get some more sector-specific data from the Museums Development England annual surveys that they've done in the last few years. And that sort of goes against the broader trend, which is encouraging in a way. So initial dip, which we see, I should say the Museums Development surveys are surveys of museums that are accredited or working towards accreditation in England, and excluding National Trusts, Nationals, and English Heritage. And they present their data as compared to the pre-pandemic baseline, which is why everything's negative numbers here. So the big dip, and then a recovery of volunteer numbers. So we're on average now 5% below that baseline for volunteer numbers, but a slower recovery of volunteer hours, and we're about 16% on average below baseline for volunteer hours across this sample. And the sample was 704 museums, which is about half the accredited museums in England. What's really interesting is when you get in the detail, which is why I did the poll, is that actually, though, that sort of recovery varies by the type and size of museum. So we see here that for all museums, the average is 5% below baseline, but for organizations with multiple sites, you're looking at 15% below baseline, micro and larger between that, and then back to baseline for small to medium museums, which is kind of interesting that the recovery, or the, call it the recovery, correlates with the size of museum. It also correlates with where you are in the country. So there are parts of the country that seem to be back to that pre-pandemic baseline. So southeast of England, Yorkshire and the northwest, but other parts that are still where volunteer numbers have not recovered. The largest, or the least recovered, if you like, is West Midlands. I think this is a typo. The Northeast has 15%. I think that should probably have been minus 15%. And then East of England at minus 14%. So location matters for some reason. If we don't know why, that's what the data seems to suggest. Similarly for volunteer hours, again, the type of museum seems to matter. So all museums, the average was minus 14%, so 14% below baseline. But organizations with multiple sites were reporting being 28% less than baseline, with the others in between. Now, what's really interesting in this, for me, because I like data, can't help it, is that although 700 sites completed the whole survey, they could choose which questions they wanted to answer. So only about 284 sites completed the questions about volunteer headcount, percentage change in volunteer headcount, and only about 202 completed the question about percentage change in volunteer hours. So which suggests that maybe not everyone is gathering the data that enables them to answer that question. And that's worth bearing in mind when we come to the next slide, which is about, if you like, perceived changes in volunteers. Because now for this question, about 584, I think it was, people responded to this question. So we're getting a slightly different answer, but also the data is slightly different, if you like. So what this is asking is about are the levels of volunteer hours committed by individual volunteers, are they increasing, about the same, or decreasing? And this is looking at 2022 here and 2023. And what the overall trend is showing is that actually the volunteer managers are more optimistic about the level of volunteer hours in 2023 than they were in 2022, which is good. And they're also more optimistic about the number of new volunteers being recruited, because that's going up from 35% to 43%. So the volunteer managers are more optimistic, and that's the perceived change. But there's something, the data is not quite the same as the other two questions. So overall, then for the sort of museum sector, again, we're not talking about heritage sites as well, or they may be included, but for that data set, then it shows an overall recovery of volunteer numbers, but the rate of recovery depends on the size, depends on the location. What the data also shows is actually the contribution of volunteers to an organization varies strongly according to whether it's an independent local authority, university, and so on. So then you might expect also the recovery to depend on those types as well, but they don't present that data. So then I want to move on from there to think about, so that's about, if you like, volunteer behaviors. We can also think about volunteer motivations. And we've got two sort of solid sources of information for this. One is the community life survey data, and one is the NCVO's time well spent surveys of 2019 and 2023. So this is stuff I've extracted from the community life survey data. They ask questions about motivations for volunteering, and over the 3 years that are reported, so 2019, 2020, 2019, 20, 2020, 21, 21, 22, actually the motivations are really stable. I've shown here the top 4 out of, I think, a list of 10 or so. There's no significant change in volunteer motivations according to the community life survey data. Similarly, there's very little change in terms of barriers to volunteering. Obviously, COVID appears as a barrier to volunteering and then diminishes, which is in line with the ALVA data about visitors as well, that the concern about COVID has diminished over the last couple of years. Otherwise, all the other categories are fairly stable. So there's no change in motivation, and there's no change in barriers, according to the community life survey data. The NCVO data is for Great Britain rather than just England, and they helpfully distinguish between the motivation for starting and the motivation for continuing, which is a useful distinction. And again, the motivation for starting, the top one is the same as community life survey data. I want to help things, help people, is stable. That's not changed. And the motivation for continuing, the difference I'm making, again, is stable, and there's no significant change there. Also, the reasons for stopping from the NCVO data are fairly stable. So the volunteering causes me too much stress is increased, and they highlight that, but otherwise all the other categories, and the main one being I have less time because my circumstances are changing, they're all fairly stable. So for me, this is sort of intriguing. We see this change in behavior and changes over time, long term and in the last few years, but no change in motivations. So there's a gap which niggles at the researcher in me as to what's happening, why have the behaviors changed if the motivations are stable. The NCVO survey, the 2023 survey, they pick out some other things to think about. So overall volunteer satisfaction is down. There's an increase in volunteers who feel that their volunteering is too much like paid work, going up from 19% to 26%. There's some questions to ask about that, because actually the importance of that might well depend on who the volunteer is and what their motivations are for the volunteering. Non-volunteers increasingly talk about valuing flexibility, and there's also a discussion of the financial impact of volunteering as an increasing barrier. So there are other linked changes. other possibilities, that things that are going on. There's the possibility that people just found other forms of volunteering, other forms of civic participation. So if we go back to that first bit of data, the peak in individual volunteering, people might have gone out and done different things during the pandemic and just changed their minds about what they want to do. We don't know. It's a possibility. Since lockdown has eased, there's also been a cost of living crisis. That then ties to the financial impact of volunteering, but it might also have other implications. So older volunteers might be more involved in caring for grandchildren, children. And some people might have found that actually they need to do more work or go back to work, and therefore their ability to volunteer is changed. I've stuck in this diagram from Principi, Limura and Jensen's work, which is a pan-European study on older volunteers, and they try and set individual volunteering decisions into a broader context and thinking about all the different factors that shape people's capacity to volunteer. And it's a really well thought out framework, and you can see how parts of the cost of living crisis can affect some of those other contextual factors that shape someone's capacity or ability to engage in volunteering. So in a way, we could ask the question, well, is there a need to worry? I mean, the annual museum survey shows slow recovery in volunteer number and volunteer hours, notwithstanding that there's lots of variation within that. So you could just ask, well, can organizations just wait it out and hope that volunteer numbers and volunteer hours return to pre-pandemic norms? It's a possibility. It's a question. There's still this niggling thing that bothers me about the difference, the disconnect between volunteer behaviors and motivations. And so there's a question for us about whether there's a merit in finding out why people haven't returned. So what we'd like to do is, in the next part of the workshop, is just have a discussion. And these are the questions, and in a moment we'll stick them in the chat as well. So have you experienced a fall in volunteer numbers since lockdown was eased? Have you found it more difficult to recruit and retain volunteers? Have you changed the way you recruit and work with volunteers since then? And how do you feel about this idea of recovery? Are you optimistic, pessimistic? Have you just changed the way you're doing things and you're actually looking forward to a new normal? So I'll stop sharing there. And I'll stick the questions in the chat. Now, there's quite a lot of people. Shall we keep it in one group, Vanessa, or do you want to go for, shall we split it into two?
There's 4 questions. How about 4 breakout rooms?
Okay.
Concentrate on each question. So depending on which room you go into, whether you be in room 1, take question 1. If you're in room 2, take question 2. If you're in 3, take question 3. 4, take question 4. So if we put you into 4 breakout rooms, how long would you like them in the rooms for?
Shall we say 15 minutes? I think that's about pretty much what we planned for, wasn't it?
Okay.
Well, we had it. I was in group 3. I'll start. Just basically, the answer was it's all very different, and there's quite a variety across the different organisations. We were looking at the way groups recruit and work with volunteers, and there's across our small group, there's quite a diversity with different pros and cons. So there wasn't a single answer to whether people have changed or not. Some have, some haven't. So would anyone like feedback from group 1?
I was nominated right at the end. But yeah, I think broadly we agreed that everyone had experienced a fall in volunteer numbers, and Joy very kindly kind of provided some specific statistics from Oxford University, and we were kind of talking about how having that data to hand is really useful to allow you to make kind of arguments within the organisation. And like you were saying at the start, Bruce, if people aren't answering those questions on a national level as well, it's hard to identify the problem and perhaps some of the reasons behind that. We talked a little bit about whether it was a continuation of a pre-pandemic trend, like those wider generational changes, and just briefly touched on some kind of potential solutions as well about how we kind of maintain relationships and continue communications, enabling people to move more seamlessly between kind of either the same organisation, or if you're multiple sites, yeah, take advantage of that opportunity.
Okay, thank you very much. It's really interesting. Group 2.
Yeah, I don't mind feeding back. We at the end we were starting to talking about solutions, so I probably forgot the very beginning discussion. So if anyone else wanted to chip in, then please do. I think there was quite a few similar views to say the answer was yes. They found it difficult after the lockdowns to recruit volunteers. Probably just from a more personal experience, we found it difficult depending on the age range and demographic of the volunteers for more formal roles. Definitely younger volunteers were aiming for that more flexible opportunity and the micro volunteering opportunities, whereas maybe older volunteers were definitely retained in those volunteering opportunities, which were a bit more like the once a week still. And then we had some nice discussions around the possible solutions and retention of volunteers, and we talked about kind of taste the volunteering sessions, and I mentioned something that we're doing here at Chester Zoo where we're talking about volunteer portability and that kind of thing. And I've forgotten the rest of the conversation. If anyone else wants to chip in, you're very welcome. I left the room feeling that it was very positive, and I enjoyed the conversation there.
That's good. Excellent. And group 3 was about change the way we recruit and work with volunteers since then. Just said there's quite a bit of diversity in our group about the way people recruited and work with volunteers. Would anybody else from the group like to come in on that one? All right, we'll keep going then. And then finally, group 4, how do you feel about recovery? Optimistic, pessimistic, looking forward to new normal? Would anyone like to come and talk about what was said in group 4?
Yes, I will.
Thank you.
So we're a positive bunch, actually. So everybody generally seemed to feel like there was reason to be optimistic, although I don't think we could particularly define why that was or how that was going to happen. So I think we did talk about, of course, the need, going back to the keynote speaker this morning and thinking about the transitions we need to make in who we're involving and how we're involving people. And I don't think that feels easy, but possible. But we didn't specify how. Yes, that's kind of it, Bruce.
That's all right. That sounds good. That's okay. Well, I'll tell you what that feeds into. Part of the motivation for doing this is because, obviously it started from having conversations with people saying they couldn't, their numbers were lower. And that is true. Thank you from Chris. They can be unable to, you're right. Riffing off the idea in visitor studies, you also have non-visitor studies. If you won't understand the people who don't come, you ask them why they don't come. We thought there might be mileage in asking people who haven't come back to volunteering why they haven't come back. So that's part of the underlying motive for doing this is a way to say, okay, there's that group of people, maybe they haven't come back since the pandemic. And if you want to understand why, then the other way to do it is to ask them. The challenge with that, of course, is reaching out to those people, because volunteer managers can't, for example, so we've created a survey for people who haven't come back to volunteering with heritage organizations, but no one can give me the details of people who haven't come back. The only way we can do it is if volunteer managers who think there might be some mileage in doing so actually reach out for us. So if you've seen a drop in volunteer numbers, or if you think you're interested, then please get in touch, because we've got a survey for people who haven't come back, where we just ask them, can do it online, can do it hard copy, could even phone them if need be, and try and find out a bit more about their decision making, why they haven't come back, what they're doing with their time now, and that sort of thing. And then we'll collate that into a report in the new year. So that's my plea at the end of this session. If you're interested, if you want to know more about that group of people and why they've not come back, please get in touch by my email, which is bruce.davenport@newcastle.ac.uk. And that's all we had to say, and we're pretty much on time, which is fabulous. So